My name's Ian Stevenson. I work for Conservation Lower Zambezi down in the southeast of Zambia. But we're here to talk about the protection of wild dogs and different approaches to the protection of wild dogs in Africa, very special species. So I've got a very experienced panel in front of me. I'm going to pass the mic around, let them introduce themselves. This is a very informal approach. We've got a few slides, etc. We're going to ask each of the panelists a series of questions, and at the end there'll be time for questions and answers. So let me pass on to Elke.
Thank you. I'm Elke. I previously worked for WWF as International Wildlife Program Manager on mainly wildlife crime, human-wildlife conflict, and technology for wildlife. And recently I moved to Zambia to work for a Zambian Carnivore program, where I'm the new data manager in charge of setting up SMART and also the integration with EarthRanger. So I'm more the tech person at ZZB, but we'll also talk about wild dogs today.
Thank you. Hi everybody, my name is Plessis. I work for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. My primary role in the organization is to coordinate the Carnivore range expansion project. I've been doing it for about 8 years now, and essentially from some of the successes we've had through our reintroductions, we now work with partners and collaborate with partners throughout Southern Africa, where we've successfully reintroduced wild dogs in the likes of Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John McNutt. Most people who know me from the wild dog world know me as Tico. Started the wild dog research project for my PhD in 1989, and I've been in Botswana since then, with my wife having organized and built a conservation NGO called Entrust, based out of Maun, just outside the Okavango Delta.
Good afternoon. My name is António Paulo Tonecas. I'm from Mozambique. I'm a wildlife vet. I'm working in Gorongosa National Park, as a vet full-time, also doing monitoring of wild dogs. Now I'm currently working like as a field operation manager at law enforcement.
Right, thanks very much, everyone. We're going to break this into three sort of areas. The first one is going to be on wild dog monitoring and a couple of questions around that and a few slides. And then the next one will be on collaboration to protect the wild dogs. And then the last one is on reintroduction. So these are going to be fired away to a few of the panelists here. We'll start with Elke. You had a question about the main challenges and important reasons for monitoring wild dogs in Zambia, and to elaborate on some of your work that's being done up there with the Zambian Carnivore program.
Yeah, so Zambian Carnivore program monitors the 5 large carnivore species in Zambia. This is more or less the overview of the work that we do. It's a method called field-based protection work. So we make sure that we monitor the large carnivores, amongst which the wild dogs, intensively, aerial and on the ground. So we have several field teams out every day in the different areas that we work to monitor the carnivore species, then collect long-term data, demography data, reproduction and survival. We have a close collaboration with Montana University in the States. And then we also ID all the individuals. So, for example, for the wild dogs, we know all the individuals that we monitor. So that enables us to record important information over time and to follow their populations. So these are some figures from 2022. So for wild dogs specifically, we monitored 444 individuals in 49 packs and dispersal groups. And we do that across 5 areas, which is an area about 30,000 square kilometers. These are the 3 main areas. So that's Greater Kafue ecosystem, Greater Lua ecosystem, and then Luangwa Valley ecosystem. You can see the numbers here, how many wild dogs we have per ecosystem, how many we color, and then we have close collaborations with the partners in those areas. We have a close collaboration with DMPW, that's the department in Zambia who's in charge for national parks and wildlife. And then we work with African parks in Lua and Kafui. In Kafui, we work with Panthera and Musikesi. And then in Luangwa, we work with Frankfurt Zoological Society in the north and with CSL in the south. And one of the main challenges in all of the areas is snaring, not necessarily for the dogs, but mainly bycatch, and also prey depletion, which leaves less prey for wild dogs. So we see that this is a huge impact on the wild dog populations. If you can go to the next slide. Another one, please. So we did a study following one of the wild dog packs. This is Kakumbi pack, and this pack lives mainly in the GMA. So this is an example of Luangwa. The Luangwa River is the natural boundary of the park. So we don't have any fences. And you see that Kakumbi pack, the black dots, spend most of their time outside the park. So the park is usually a high lion density, so the wild dogs tend to avoid those areas. But then they come into an area where there is a lot of snaring. So these are represented by the orange dots. So you see that it's a huge risk for the wild dogs to run into snares themselves, but also to live in an area where a lot of prey are caught in snares, so it's difficult for them to find food. So the work that we do is to color the wild dogs, to intensively monitor them every day. We send field teams out to track them. And then one of the most important components is that we have a field-based vet, which really helps if we get an alert that there is a wild dog snared, then that vet can immediately get in and de-snare the dog. And then we work together with the department, CSL and other partners to also do patrols for de-snaring and removing snare sets in the area.
Right, I'm going to hand over next to Cole. There was a question about following reintroductions. What's the importance of that intensive post-release monitoring to determine both short and long-term success?
Thank you very much. I think just to give a brief background to the project in terms of what together the Wild Dog Advisory Group and the Endangered Wildlife Trust kicked off in 1998. The last remaining population that was left in the country was in the Kruger National Park. And the idea back then was to adopt this management of population concept where we had started reintroducing packs into small and medium-sized reserves, basically to increase safe space for wild dogs. Obviously, in that, we presented ourselves with its own problems in that you're now dealing with packs that move large distances. They had to be intensively monitored just to, from both from a monitoring and a management standpoint. You're suddenly dealing with breakouts, community conflict. In the case of the last 10 years or so in South Africa, we've lost about 78 wild dogs just to canine distemper and rabies because we're sharing these hard boundaries between these protected areas and the communities or the farmers. Especially, I think, following COVID, we've also seen an increase in snaring. So basically, in terms of the South African context, we know that monitoring is vital to basically allow us to monitor the populations and their well-being, but to also show some level of accountability as part of the prerequisites to that reintroduction. I think what's been like an interesting challenge and process for us is also just defining that success. We're dealing with an endangered species, and whenever we reintroduce them somewhere, there's a high level of accountability in that we want them to do well. And if they don't do well, we need to know why. And especially as we've worked with the likes of Tonecas to take wild dogs into Gorongosa National Park, we've moved up to Lua Plains. We've now reintroduced wild dogs into Majeti and into Luanda National Park. Along the way, we've learned some of those major threats. I think we've become more proactive as to how we've dealt with those. But in saying that, there's two important components that we have to measure. So there's both the short-term success, which essentially means have the pack that we've now bonded, do they stay together? Are they able to defend their prey? Have they managed to rear their pups? Are they eating successfully? And then the longer-term success for us is generally when those pups become sub-adults, are they able to leave their natal pack, find unrelated pack members, and form new packs of their own, and in essence build their population. So In terms of the importance of monitoring, I think, if we were to reintroduce wild dogs and there were suddenly massive red flags where dogs were dying from disease, or there was a high level of snaring, if we weren't doing that monitoring, we wouldn't understand the threats to begin with. Obviously, in the whole feasibility assessment approach, the step one is to go do a site visit. We've got a very intensive feasibility assessment that we undergo, so any reintroduction that we have done over the years takes up to 18 to 24 months before we're actually in a confident space to do that. But even once the dogs touch down and they're in those protected areas, we then need to really up the levels and understand where they do well and why they haven't done well. And yeah, as per those IUCN reintroduction guidelines, it's about eliminating that primary threat that killed them off in the first place. So yeah, the monitoring is obviously a key part of it all. It helps us guide. We have an adaptive strategy and framework that helps us guide that process. And yeah, I think in essence, without that collaborative team, without the collars, without the advancement in technology, it would certainly make our lives a whole lot more difficult. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Cole. The next one's to Tico, who's got more than 3 decades of monitoring a subpopulation in northern Botswana. And the question is, how is a new sort of technology that's out there helping you with the monitoring and changing the methods of monitoring?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. 3 decades means that when I started doing field research on wild dogs was before GPSs were available. So it was with a compass and map, if you can believe it. And so technologies have clearly changed a great deal while I've been out in the field and monitoring the same subpopulation, which for those of you are familiar with African wild dogs are aware that the largest contiguous population for this species is really centered around northern Botswana. And so we have now over 30 years of monitoring this population, really based on kind of focal studies that we feel are representative of the greater population of northern Botswana and probably pretty representative of wild dogs throughout the Khaza landscape. So I have graduate students and postdocs who are using these newer technologies, but we have a database that literally stretches all the way back to where coordinates were recorded in UTM coordinates and based off of a map. So technology has really truly changed what we do in the field and our ability to ask and answer questions about other behavior and ecology. And so when I was asked, well, how do you go about monitoring? Well, it's obviously changed a great deal, but there's in the field, and Elke was referring to all the work in the field in the Zambia Carnivore program. It's really important to actually have people watching animals on the ground. The technologies don't really provide you with everything. Once you've got a collar on an animal, that's one dog in a pack. An average pack might be 10 dogs. And you can sit back on what I'd call armchair biology and actually get fixes for that dog and assume it's a pack. But until you actually get on the ground and know what's going on, you really cannot be recording life history events and significant events like dispersal and reproduction until you're actually on the ground doing the kind of hard work in the heat and the dust and everything else. So there's 2 parts to the monitoring. There's the actual on the ground with data, and then there's kind of modeling, which would be the ability to use those data and develop models of heat maps to generate probabilities in corridor and available corridors and connectivity throughout. And I post the map here in Khaza for a reason. I describe the Khaza landscape as the most ambitious conservation initiative for carnivores anywhere in the world, really. There's 5 countries involved and over 500,000 square kilometers. And the Khaza landscape, the working group, estimated that would basically sustain about 25 to 30% of the entire wild dog population on the continent. So, that's how we've continued to contribute to the monitoring of wild dogs in the region.
Thanks very much, Tico. The last question on the monitoring side is going to go to António, and just how EarthRanger has been helping to monitor the wild dogs in Gorongosa.
EarthRanger is helping us a lot because with EarthRanger it's possible to see, for example, where wild dogs are denning, also to prevent some case of human-wildlife conflict. With EarthRanger, we know like the dogs just go out and then we make a plan and then we catch the dogs and then we bring back. Sometimes we're putting them in a bomber when they break geofence. Sometimes we're not putting in a bomber, we just release them like hot release. But EarthRanger is helping us because we know with EarthRanger with EarthRanger also we are mapping hotspot of snare, and then we put like a line of geofence. When we see dogs inside hot place like snare, we quick send the team and then clean up the area. And then, for example, now we have zero. Since 2018, we reintroduced wild dog in Gorongosa. We have zero wild dog get catched in snare or gin traps inside Gorongosa because we are using this technology to map where it's hotspot of gin traps, snare, and then also we're preventing a lot of human-wildlife conflict because we are in fenced area. And then when they cross geofence, we know we have like team on control room that they stay 24 hours monitoring the wild dogs and other protected species like lions, hyenas. And then when they go out, like we need to respond like quick as possible. EarthRanger is helping us a lot on that. Also to collect data like populations. We are monitoring, we are collecting all the data like demography, population with EarthRanger app, mobile app. And then we upload all this information to our database. And then it's helping a lot.
Perfect. Thanks very much, António. We're going to move on to collaboration. So the next question is going back to Elke. And I think we're fortunate in Zambia that there's a lot of collaboration amongst all the cooperating partners there. And they work incredibly closely together. So I'm asking you, Elke, just if you can elaborate on that a little bit and give us some examples from Zambia.
Yeah, so we closely collaborate with different partners, differing for the site. So I will give an example for Luangwa in the valley. So in South Luangwa, that's with CSL, Conservation South Luangwa, and North Luangwa with Frankfurt Zoological Society, and then in both areas with DMPW, so the department. So we do most of the anti-snaring work in the valley. That's done by DMPW and CSL in South Luangwa, Frankfurt in North Luangwa. They make sure to do patrols to remove the snare sets, but also their presence in the field, of course, helps with keeping poachers out as well. Then we do intensive monitoring. That's mainly done by us, by ZCP in South Luangwa and Frankfurt in North Luangwa. So that's what I just mentioned, that we spend every day out in the field multiple times going out to check on all the packs, prides and clans to make sure that they are doing well, that there are no snares, and that we collect the long-term data that we need. Then we have the field-based vet present, so we can always call that person in Luangwa. That's a vet that is also working in the clinic in town, so he's doing multiple jobs actually at the same time. But whenever a carnivore, for example, or wild dog is caught in a snare, we call him and we get him out in the field and make sure to desnare the dog. So it's really helpful to have him at the site so that if it's necessary that we can immediately intervene. Then we also have an airplane and a pilot. So if something happens, for example, in North Luangwa, then we can also make sure to fly the vet out to different areas. Then we also do sensitization work with the community, so that's both on snaring, so why they snare, in which areas they snare, how it impacts the wild dog populations, but also conflict, sensitization about human-wildlife conflict. Luckily, we don't have a lot of wild dog conflict in the area, mainly lion and hyena, so we work closely with the communities to support them as well on this. And then I wanted to show 2 slides for, yeah, this one. Yeah, so this is the impact of desnaring. I just wanted to show you an example. So I earlier told you that we follow all the individuals, so we know the family lines in the different packs. And you might think like desnaring one individual, how much of a help is that? But then because we collect all the individual data, we can calculate the amount of offspring from one individual. And this is Hot Springs alpha male. He's one of the oldest known males. He was 12 years old, and halfway through his life he got a lethal snare, and ZZP and CSL came in to desnare him, and afterwards we calculated that he produced 272 pups into 17 packs, which dispersed over the Luangwa Valley, so North and South Luangwa. So this shows the impact that desnaring can have, and the importance of being in the field, actually checking all the individuals and not just the colored individual. So the combination of using technology to follow the packs where they're moving, but also doing the checks actually on the ground.
Thanks very much for that. Okay, we're going to skip Cole. He's going to talk more on the reintroduction in a minute and go back over to Tico. Tico, if you'd just give a little bit of background on some of the importance of the stakeholders in Botswana, and also to explain what CASA sort of represents for the future of wild dogs.
Yeah, thanks. I already mentioned that CASA represents on the continental-wide map of the range map for African wild dogs, represents the largest contiguous population of African wild dogs anywhere. And so to a certain degree, many of the other populations that we know about are really isolated, fragmented populations that require more intensive management. And Cole talked about the metapopulation having started in 1998. It was on the heels of a meeting we had at Pretoria Zoo in 1997, saying we'd really like to have another population in South Africa, and we have all these fenced reserves that probably could support a pack or two. And so the metapopulation concept was actually implemented starting the following year, and it can only really be sustained through intensive hands-on kind of management, because the biggest question that was raised by those of us in the field was, well, what happens when there's very quickly too many dogs in these fenced reserves? And to date, even that question hasn't been really fully resolved, because it's extremely difficult for people to say, well, we got too many wild dogs, what do we do with them? Some of the metapopulation reserves have actually said we can't deal with these, and we've had to take them out. Swallow was one of the first, for example. Anyway, so collaboration with a lot of partners is critical, and then within CASA, our biggest partnership really is the CASA Carnivore Conservation Coalition, which ZCP is a part of, and Panthera is a part of, and in fact everybody working within the CASA countries is part of the KCC coalition. And so that collaboration is really critical, and which is, again, why I put up the map of CASA. So those are our most important, we have stakeholders that are government agencies, and including the Department of Vet Services and Ministry of Agriculture, but our most important collaborators in the broader landscape are within the CASA landscape.
Okay, thanks very much, Tico. We're going to move on to reintroduction, and I'm going to skip back to Cole to give us a little bit of background on the reintroduction work and how it came about in South Africa.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I think I've touched on that a little bit. I think Tico, you've summed up some of the history there, and arguably I think we all know that the biggest threat to wild dogs right now is safe space, and it's something that we do struggle with. Ironically, wild dogs are also very successful predators, so when we do put them in most places, they've gone on to do very well. So there's this constant toss-up as to what do you do with too many dogs when they're classified as an endangered species. And I think in today's talk we like kind of linking the monitoring, the collaboration, the reintroductions, and I think it all ties in quite closely to one another. I think in terms of where we are with reintroductions, we realize that there's certainly no silver bullet. We all dream of a world where in South Africa there'd be 10 Krugers, where we could just have these viable populations flourishing. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but from this meta-population concept, we have been able to contribute about 33 packs of wild dogs to the system, including, or made up of about 250 to 300 dogs. We've also been able to, through this process, manage the genetic diversity. So it's not just about growing the population numbers, but also ensuring that the population health of those dogs is important too. And if I could just tie in the collaborative approach, I think what's been quite exciting is what Tico mentioned, was the birth of the Wild Dog Advisory Group, which is something that the EWT have been quite a close part of over the last 22 years or so. More than that, sorry. But what's essentially it created was this platform where wild dog stakeholders from all walks of life, be it through the vet group, researchers, the PR side of things, the managers, they can essentially every 4 months we meet together, we can have these meetings, and through that, share notes, learn lessons, build best management practices. And yeah, essentially through that process, it's been a big part in the role that we've played through reintroductions. And I think just so one thing just to mention on that collaborative front is, us, the Endangered Wildlife Trust, we're essentially coordinators. We're able to assist reserves where we can with whether it's post-release monitoring, we can help with feasibility assessments. But it's really the African parks, the peace parks, the Gorongosa projects that's doing such exceptional work in Africa where they're restoring these systems and thereby creating opportunity to reintroduce wild dogs. And without that, there's certainly no place for us in terms of the work we would get to do. I think just bringing it back to the EarthRanger side of things in terms of that collaboration, monitoring reintroductions, it's really provided an exceptional tool where, we all know how sensitive data is, but having, a system where you can essentially, all collaborators can log in, see the dogs, not necessarily download that data, but just be able to share maps. It creates conversation and discussions. It's really helped with a lot of feedback and analysis and all the rest. So yeah, I think all in all, this the three topics today really tie in quite nicely. And yeah, we're certainly living and learning through this reintroduction process. And yeah, we just have to hope that more space can be maintained and expanded.
Thanks, Cole. Tico, maybe if you've got anything to add on that history of the metapopulation in South Africa, one thing, and then also to touch on your concept of a bio boundary and how it differs from a repellent. I think I actually also find that really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. For years, in the early 90s, in fact, late 80s, early 90s, there were attempts to reintroduce dogs into Etosha, where they'd been extirpated. And during those years, people, wildlife managers, people involved in that thinking, thought, well, we've got these dogs variously distributed around Namibia in captive environments. So we just assemble a whole bunch of them, throw them together, and toss them out into Etosha. Now, we know so much more that seems really ridiculously naive. And it was, but we know a great deal more now about how to reintroduce packs. And in fact, my dissertation work in the early 90s was about the formation of new packs, which we, when we started conceptualizing the metapopulation in South Africa, when I was involved with that, it was, some of you must know the name Gus Mills. Gus Mills and I talked about, let's not emphasize the captive population, because what we have in parts of South Africa are dogs that are being killed as problem animals on a regular basis. So our efforts for where we source dogs for reintroductions should be those. And the value of those, of course, when you've spent time with wild dogs, is that you, instead of having naive captive reared animals, you have dogs that have actually learned what they need to learn in the first couple of years of their life. And so if you mimic how a pack is formed naturally, which is from subgroups of males from one pack joining a subgroup of females from somewhere else, at least one of those subgroups needs to be experienced. You can use some of the captive population, some of the naive population, but only one of those subgroups can be naive. The others have to have enough information about how to survive in the wild, especially with other carnivores. And that's what they found in Namibia when they threw a bunch of just a collection of dogs from captive populations around Namibia that the last attempt was in 1992, and those dogs got so hungry they thought it would be perfectly okay to walk up to a bunch of lions when they were eating off of a giraffe carcass. I mean, just to illustrate what the difference between a naive dog and a dog that's grown up in the wild. So anyway, the success of the metapopulation was really born of the fact that we now understand what we need to know in terms of how to introduce a new pack, how to construct a new pack, and how to make, put together a pack that actually has the capacity to survive and make it. So that's been years of successful reintroductions. And I was hoping Cole would say a little bit about the reintroductions and more about Gorongosa, because the only real reintroduction I've been involved in outside of conceptualizing the metapopulation was reintroducing dogs into the easternmost part of Botswana called the Tule region. And the Northern Tule Game Reserve was an area of not insignificant area, maybe 400 square kilometers, which would be the average territory size of a pack of dogs in northern Botswana. But it had been converted from commercial farming, livestock farming, over several years into game reserves. And there were no dogs. There hadn't been dogs in the northern Tule for 40 years. Now, dogs had visited occasionally. They'd come through. It wasn't unusual. On occasion, they'd see dogs come through, but never did dogs stay. And so I was approached by one of the landowners there, one of the reserve owners in Mashatu, saying we're really keen to take one of these dogs, one of these packs that didn't work in the metapopulation and created problems for the metapopulation managers and the working group. Can you take them into the Tule? And I was asked, if we release them into the Tule, what's going to happen? And I said, well, what's going to happen is there's no dogs there, and they're going to range outside of the Tule until they get run into conflict with farmers. And I expressed this concern. That was the concern of the Department of Wildlife, who was really hesitating to give permits to reintroduce them into Tule. And so we were just starting our bioboundary research project, which Ian's just mentioned. And the bioboundary research project was based on our knowledge about the fact that the ranging behavior of resident packs of wild dogs is completely predicated on their desire and their need to know where their neighbors are. And so when they don't have neighbors, they just keep moving. They keep looking. And so there may be plenty of prey in areas, but it's not sufficient to establish a population in the absence of their need to know where they have neighbors, as if where they've identified neighbors through scent marks, they understand that this habitat is suitable for wild dogs. So the proposal was to reintroduce these dogs into Northern Tule Game Reserve, but for us to establish, before release, a biologically relevant boundary, because it's an unfenced reserve, and a biologically relevant boundary is basically a scent mark boundary, is what they're looking for. So over the next 3.5 years, having laid out literally translocated urine and scat, which while we don't know the chemistry of that, and we're still working on that, we assumed that the scent marks were to be found in those marks. And so we collected marks from the population, our focal population in northern Botswana, and cataloged all those samples and translocated them into basically a perimeter boundary around the Northern Tule Game Reserve. And so this work was published in 2012, where we literally didn't touch those dogs for 3 years, but when they did leave the area, which they do, and not surprisingly, we would just go and surround them with scent marks and bounce them back. And so we managed them using scent marks. And so this was kind of a proof of the importance for us. It was a proof of concept that where you can reintroduce dogs into an area and you can actually manage them with chemistry. And so the BioBoundary project is really focused on basically identifying and deciphering what are the compounds that are salient, or real flags of compounds that the wild dogs are looking for, because all mammals are out there living in an olfactory world, and dogs in particular. I mean, just think of the dogs, what we know of domestic dogs. So their world is olfactory, and they definitely identify scent marks that are conspecific. So there's chemistry in there that is specific to wild dogs. And so we have a laboratory that was originally funded by Paul Allen and the Paul Allen Family Foundation, that is a gas chromatography mass spec lab based in Mountain, that's dedicated to answering this question: how do wild dogs talk to each other about territory boundaries? And we are currently putting together a recipe of candidate compounds after years of doing these analyses in conjunction with behavioral observations of dogs in the field, and running experiments now looking for what probably should be described as biological or behavioral bioassays. Can we get them to respond to a synthetic scent mark the way we expect them to natural scent marks? So that's what the BioBoundary research is about.
No, amazing. Absolutely incredible. Yeah. Okay, the last question we're going to pass on to António to just give us a bit more of a background on the reintroduction of the dogs post-war in Gorongosa.
Okay, we first reintroduced wild dogs in Gorongosa in 2018 with collaboration with EWT, COL. We starting first to study the condition if it's possible to bring wild dogs in 2016. Then we found like we have enough praise, and then enough praise, and then good area also in terms of size. In the first time we brought in 14 wild dogs, and then now 5 years, in total we reintroduced 4 times, total 48 wild dogs, including this year we received wild dogs from food corridor. There was not place to stay because they crossed South Africa to Mozambique, and then they were starting to die about snare, and then we received them. And then total we have, since the first reintroduction, we have 206 wild dogs now, and then it's a successful story of reintroduction of wild dogs in unfenced area, and then low number of conflict between human-wildlife conflict, and then also all the death we found on wild dogs, no snared wild, only one snared outside the buffer zone, and then inside 0 snared. And then we have great successful of reintroduction. Yeah, I think it's all about. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely applause to you. Yeah, excellent work. Yeah. Okay, that's it. But we're going to open the floor up for some questions. So if people would have any questions for the panel, please stick your hand up, and I'll bring the mic over. Yep. You keep that mic here to respond.
Hey, everyone. So my question for any of your collaring events or whatnot, I'm really curious if any of you have done research into, does one collar, how much does it represent the pack as a whole in terms of movement or conflict event or anything, any type of behavior? Yeah, just curious if you've asked questions about exactly how many collars per pack or per whatnot you need to thoroughly understand what's going on.
That's a good question, because it highlights my statement about the fact that collars really only give you so much. And I'm glad you raised it. But it depends on the questions you're asking. For example, there's the talk on deep learning. For example, there's one of my postdocs, for example, is doing similar work where they have accelerometer data, which, if you know anything, is sort of dimensionless. But it can be representative of behavior. And so one of the interesting things about dogs is they live as a pack. They do everything as a pack. And so if you're really looking at behavior, when they're running, most of them are running. And when they're eating, they're all eating. And, so those data you can actually glean from a single collar if it's recording with accelerometer data, three-dimensional. However, dispersal, for example, important life history events, where dispersal and gene flow are at your questions, collar can't give you that. In the absence of getting these data, you can see that, hey, well, this dog has moved as a dispersing group, and when he left, there were three brothers went together, and you might get a fix every day for the next 10 months, and trace it across from Moremi Game Reserve in the Okavango to Wangi, for example, but we don't know that there's still three dogs. We don't know whether there was a successful dispersal. We don't know whether those dogs found females until you get on the ground and actually spend enough time to see. So it's a questionable proxy for dispersal and gene flow when you are just looking at A to B as a dispersal event, because gene flow requires reproduction. So it depends on what your question is and what you can get out of a single collar in a pack.
Right. Any more questions?
I should point out that their average mortality is about 20% among adults. So it's really good to keep more than one collar in a pack.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I'm curious, and I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think would have been the status of wild dogs in Botswana if you were absent for 35 years?
Well, you can't give me all the credit. Let's just say that. There's no question that in these years, there's been if I was asked what is one of your biggest successes, I think I'd have to answer that I get calls from farmers now. Instead of immediately sort of as a reaction to seeing wild dogs and shooting them, they call and say, "Is there something we can do? I understand this is an endangered species. I've got a problem," and I engage in a conversation and say, "What does that problem look like? How many animals have you lost? How many animals do you have?" And so there's been an important change in that regard, and maybe that's because we're there for all those years. But northern Botswana and the Kaza landscape, there'd still be dogs there. They do very well because it's a wholly unfenced, certainly throughout northern Botswana, a wholly unfenced habitat that they do very well in, especially the riparian systems of Chobe and Linyanti and the Okavango.
Maybe I can just follow on where I'm going with this, and what I'm thinking about is between the South African model and Botswana, we have two very different problems. In South Africa, we are actually trying to get dogs back on working land, while in Botswana and Zambia, you actually still have land which is not that intensively used or owned to that extent. And I just wonder if people really go and sit down and think about it very hard, what can be learned from the two, and what is the essence, central thing that make it a success potentially? Because going forward, I think we're going to end up more in a South African scenario rather than a current Botswana scenario, and we need to think about the way forward to make it work. Thanks.
Yeah, not to put too sharp a point on it, Botswana only has 2.2 million people. So the landscape we're working in, is low-hanging fruit with respect to the long-term survival of African wild dogs, and it's a much bigger challenge to deal with the areas in South Africa outside of Kruger.
Does anyone want to add on to that?
But maybe my question is just, we're going to add 1 billion people to Africa in the next 24 years. So we have to learn from each other to try and not get into the South African position.
Yeah, and interesting you point that out. I've included slides of the projection of human population growth in some of my talks in the past, and it's true that we're projected by 2050 to have over 2 billion people on this continent. Fortunately for African wild dogs, most of that growth is in East Africa and West Africa. And if you look at the projected human population trajectory in Southern Africa, where wild dogs almost certainly are most likely to have a long-term future, that human population growth is nowhere near exponential.
Right. Any more questions?
Tico, I often get asked why individual ID is so important, and why I'm asking the question. For those that perhaps don't know why individual ID adds so much to the picture, could you just elaborate on that for us?
There's two parts to that. To that, at least in my mind, there's two parts. And one of them, the first part is, if we want to really understand anything about life history of what this endangered species is about, we need to understand that every individual out there has its own life history. And I characterize our focus over all these years as what we'd call quantitative natural history. These life history events really characterize what the species is. We've basically rewritten the natural history book for this species by looking at it in the habitats where it still persisted. Prior to the work in Southern Africa, the natural history book was written by people in the short grass plains of the Serengeti. Now that is not optimal wild dog habitat, and it's not a surprise that they disappeared from there more than once in the period from the mid-'70s when they started really talking about them. So in order to characterize that book, that natural history understanding, it needs to be based on quantitative results from knowing the life histories of individuals from the time you can identify them as pups to their, what they did in their life. The second part of that is Cecil. You all know about Cecil the lion, right? Cecil the lion was a lion that was hunted in Zimbabwe, but because he had a name and a history with a research project, and when he was shot, the entire world was inflamed about it. Knowing these animals as individuals changes the way people think about them. And so that's the second part of the answer to that question. Every animal out there is an individual. Whether you think it's important to identify them as an individual or not, it makes a difference to really appreciate that they're all individuals and they all have their own life histories. And Cecil the lion is a perfect example of the difference between not thinking of them as individuals, thinking of rather just another lion, and one who actually we know something about.
Thank you.
Time for one last question. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so my question is, have you faced any roadkills when it comes to painted dogs and the solutions to protect the dogs from the roadkills?
Yeah, I can give it a go. Certainly roadkills are identified as one of the big threats to wild dogs, and I think, Andy can attest to it. We've had dispersal groups in South Africa that are suddenly leave their natal pack to go in search of unrelated dogs, and so long as they're not finding what they're looking for, they just keep moving. And we've had wild dogs leaving South Africa, going right into Zim, up to the Booby Conservancy, and coming all the way back down within a couple of days, and you're looking at sometimes several hundred kilometers in the space of a week. There's the farms, there's the communities, but yeah, in terms of some of the road work that we're doing, I can speak more on the South African front. Is within the Endangered Wildlife Trust, we actually have a program that specializes in those and identify, not for just wild dogs, but for animals in general, and identify problem areas, identify areas where there are protected species moving over major roads, And I know just from collaborating once again with partners through signs, through the traffic departments, through underground tunnels, there's constantly work being done to try better that level of connectivity. But yeah, quite honestly speaking, specifically to wild dogs, it's I think the best case scenario is again through collars, through monitoring, through EarthRanger. When there are those alerts and we do need to react, we try our best to be there. When they're covering hundreds of kilometers in a week, then it's very difficult to keep up. It's just not one of the major threats that we necessarily focus on, at least in South Africa.
Right. Yeah, interesting. We've just had a big pack of wild dogs in the lower Zambezi twice in a space of a year now, lying in the road night over a blind hill and a vehicle going through the pack. Yeah, so not nice. And we're looking at now signs, speed bumps, looking at those blind areas that are difficult for people. Just as the traffic increases and the dog populations increase, it becomes a bigger and bigger problem. Yeah. Okay, I'd like to say a big thank you to the whole panel, all that expertise. So thank you very much. Yeah,